So does anybody have any urgent questions or lingering questions that they've come across from high trust?
Not so far.
Has anybody had a lot of experience going, oh, sorry, jump in, Brian. I didn't mean to.
Oh, no, it's been a pretty predictable week from the high trust side.
Right. Has anybody had experience going from an R2 over to either an I1 or an E1?
I have a client that has backed away from the R2 to the I1. At this point, since they're concentric circles, it was really kind of a non-event.
Okay. So my question is more about the pragmatics of it. What happens? So this client, it's a very the client in question is a very small organization, uh, and I'm trying to make sure that they're guided correctly, and the R2 plus some other factors. I mean, they had over 800 controls. It was an inordinate number of controls for a very small organization. We're talking less than 100 employees. So, I was delighted for their decision to move to an I1 because I think it's better suited for their organization in all likelihood. Taking a cautious look at their overall needs and how they're progressing, and they're still going to have some other factors and stuff in there, so it's likely going to be more than the flat I1 controls. But in terms of logistics, have you had specific feedback or experience with what happens to the caps, in terms of any caps that were on cycle to be reviewed at the following assessment? What happens with those? Not the interim assessment, but caps that were actually scheduled on a 2-year time frame, so for the next assessment.
Yeah. I didn't notice any. They didn't bring any
Okay.
back, but I can't believe that it was as big as that client was. I can't believe we didn't have some in there. They just didn't. There weren't any that rolled back to the I1. There
Okay.
were some challenges in my CSF. I know that will surprise you, that took them to work with support staff. Um, my CSF did not like what they had done on the back end somewhere. I don't know. Um,
Okay.
but
Is
that's
that like
just
the documentation or trying to clone it? Because that's another question I have is, can
it.
I
Yeah,
clone that assessment into an I1? What does that?
we were not able to roll it forward.
Okay.
So it was a start from scratch, and we actually lost access to the R2s for a while. Um,
Really?
it just my CSF is weird. Support fixed it. It's just my CSF is goofy. Um,
Okay.
so support fixed it for us, and we were able to get to them again, but we were not able to roll forward.
Okay.
And
Good to know.
to make sure I'm tracking with the caps, were they for controls that are applicable within both R2 and I1?
I was not paying that much attention, to be honest. I was just delighted
It's
that it was a smaller assessment. Um, and
Hmm.
so I don't, I'm an assessor, so I do 40 a year, and I lose track of who has caps where. So
Yeah.
I
well,
don't know.
talking out of my you know what, which tends to get me in trouble. I would think that if the control's applicable in R2 but not I1, doesn't it just go away?
If there were any, it must have.
Right. So, I mean, that seems to be the easy answer, right? Is that it no longer applies, so the progress on it's not relevant. I just didn't want to assume that and guide in the wrong direction. And this is where being a consultant in my role gets a bit tricky because I'm not an assessor. I'm not seeking assessor licensing, and I do that kind of on purpose. I don't want any of the assessors that I work with to be concerned that I'm trying to swipe their clients. I'm not an assessor. That's not what I do. I specifically go in on the client side. I think somebody on one of these calls a few weeks ago called me a Sherpa.
That's a
I'm a
good title.
Sherpa. So I go in and I guide, I kind of shepherd the process through, so I'm not specifically the preparation person, helping install technical things or rewriting policies and procedures, but I guide the process through. I help review and interpret, elements of evidence, without ever, I don't have the technical expertise. So there definitely are certain things where I poke questions and ask, and I'm like, right, what are we looking at here? But I ask questions. That's what I do. And I make sure that I can interpret and connect the dots. And all the, on average, 5 to 10,000 pieces of documentation that go with R2s, because that's what I'm usually called in for. But this is where I tend to feel like it would be great if HITRUST could come forward with some sort of additional training or guidance or something for folks who are just trying to go through and not trying to get licensed or certified. I suppose if there was a certification associated with my Sherpaism, that I wouldn't be opposed to it. but it's not a common role, I guess. So I don't know how many people would want it.
There is a readiness assessor role within
Yeah,
HITRUST.
yeah. And I looked at that, and it's also not quite the right fit. There are just some fundamental differences. So that's not quite where I'm going. But yeah,
Okay.
anyways,
I just want to make sure you knew it existed.
I appreciate that. I did, because initially when I was doing research, I didn't know it existed. Somebody raised it to me. I investigated it, to make sure that, if there was something that I could use, that I embraced that approach. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. Maybe I'll go down that path at some point and expand what I do to include the readiness. But um, we'll see.
The big killer for me, because prior to coming back to auditing, I did the same thing, and Audit Sherpa was actually a title I used. So
Oh,
it
really?
was really cool. A client
I love it.
told me that's what you are. You're our Sherpa, and I'm like, you know what? That's
Hmm.
exactly what I want to be.
Yeah.
I did not pursue the readiness because they insisted that two people be CCSFPs within your organization, and
Oh, well, don't have to.
my organization was me. Yeah, I was just
Yeah.
I was kind of monetizing a side gig while I was doing CISA work, and so I'm like, well, I could get my wife one, I guess, but I mean,
My
what would
husband
be
wouldn't
the
even entertain
point?
that conversation. Nope, hard no.
So,
He
you
knows
know,
enough about HITRUST.
she's technically part of the LLC, I suppose, but yeah,
Yeah.
I wasn't
Well, if
gonna
you're willing to
chase it.
spawn a second personality, that might work.
That worked. Yeah, I could create
Yeah.
a shadow partner.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but I know I might be unusual, but I know I'm not the only one who does what I do. So it's just, that's where it gets a bit trickier. And I think a lot of us who do this are independent,
Hmm.
because it's just, we kind of found a niche and there are people who are interested in it. And so it's following that. But, I've been in regular conversations with HITRUST because I'm like, we're on average, we love HITRUST because we don't have to do it, but we do it.
Yeah.
We don't work for anybody who says you have to do HITRUST as part of this job. We've dedicated ourselves to HITRUST because in some twisted universe, we just can't let it go.
And I'll understand if you're not at liberty to answer, but is the small entity you're referring to from a chicken and the egg, are they doing it because they think it's a good idea? Or are they actually getting pressure from customers or anyone to have the HITRUST, be it an I2 or, I'm sorry, I1 or R2? Is there power of choice?
From what I understand, it is not their choice. It is a requirement from a governing body.
To not
So it
have the
is
R2?
Is it just,
the HITRUST is a requirement
Oh,
from the
okay.
governing body.
Okay.
but they're not
Going from the
specifying
R2,
which?
going
Go
from the
ahead, sorry.
R2 to the I1 has been I believe, a process of negotiation,
Hmm,
That makes sense.
okay.
because they're not the only one within the context of the governing body, and they're not the only ones who have struggled with it, because some of the other entities are also smaller organizations. So I think that's been, and when you're looking at yes, keeping data safe is absolutely imperative. And I regularly tell people that if you can't afford a high trust audit, you 100% cannot afford the lawyer fees that you're going to land in whatever hot water if you get it wrong. And that's the fines and the cleanup and everything else. That's not even scratching the surface of some of the new regulations that are coming that will make it possible for people who have data there to actually pursue civil litigation. So we haven't even scratched that surface yet. But high trust is expensive. And when you're talking about smaller organizations, there's what I often refer to as an appropriate level of circumstance. You can't, it might be the best, but there are literally organizations that don't bring enough money to sustain either the assessments or some of the regulatory controls that go with it, because some of them are designed for larger organizations. They're designed for definite separation when you get here and here, and it's not quite looking at the same situation that a smaller organization who's got maybe a handful of clients has regular connection with all of them. It's just different. I look at my business and I think, gosh, if I had to, walk through all the same hoops as like a Deloitte or an Ernst & Young, I'd kill myself with admin. It wouldn't work for me. And it wouldn't make sense for me, I think is more important on that. Anyways, so I appreciate you sharing. Jump in, Brian.
I did get the feeling from HITRUST that they weren't thrilled about it. I think their path is they always want you moving towards the more expensive assessment. They're a business.
Mm-hmm.
So like they didn't seem particularly excited about encouraging a smooth path to go for the cheaper assessment once you've already done the more expensive one. I know they're working, and there's a lot of communication with the assessors on the E1 to the I1 and then expanding the I1 to the R2, and we do that with some frequency. But the going backwards, I don't think they were excited about that as a general plan to the point that they would make it easy, because that undermines what they earn.
Right. As a PR point of consideration, it might have been useful for them to separate out then the breach rate from an R2 versus an I1 or an E1. Because when they initially published that, I expected that those statistics were gathered for R2 assessments, because the E1 and the I1, frankly, haven't been out that long. So I wasn't sure they would even have meaningful data on it. But Susan said she asked them, and it applies to all of their assessment types. So that's an interesting position. I'm not sure it provides quite the incentive for an R2.
It is. You would think they would separate that, because I would imagine, I mean, E1 is just basic cyber hygiene, and it skips so many things that I would expect as the E1 becomes more common that those numbers are not going to get better.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I agree, because I was looking at that going, how is it possible that an R1 or an R2 holds value if you can achieve the same very, very limited breach rate with an E1 or even an I1? I mean, that's...
And meet your contractual requirements. I have a lot of people that are getting their new contract says not an E1, but it always just said HITRUST certified. So they were like, yay, we just do an E1 and we're good. And I think the customers are catching on. The bigger ones are starting to require either a path. I've seen contracts that say, we'll take an E1 for 2 years, but it needs to be moving to an I1 or whatever. But I agree. It's weird that they haven't separated that out, because I don't know how protected I really feel. E1's a great start. I love it. I'm glad it exists. I can knock one out super quick. They're nice money for an assessor. They're a good thing, but they're as a CISO on the other side, do vCISO stuff here and there when it doesn't conflict with assessing. I don't like anyone much in the sense of
Mm,
really securing data depending on what I'm giving you.
yeah. No, I agree, and I've spoken with investors because I've suggested that investors should look more closely at high trust requirements, before they go throwing money, because there's a lot of health tech startups and there's a lot of interest in, kind of getting into the billion-dollar, global market and all of that, because America's a fabulous, place to start, and big, I'll say big budgets on that, but usually they can be somewhat more desperate budgets,
Yeah.
and money ends up getting thrown in the wrong direction. But there are new global entries into this marketplace. There are countries considering pursuing healthcare that looks a lot like America's healthcare, and they're specifically, in conversations. I know that there have been conversations with HITRUST, but in general, if where I've spoken to investors and they're looking at health tech or anything that's really regulated, because HITRUST has benefits beyond healthcare. So when I'm looking at technology, anything that's touching on personal information, I've talked to folks who were getting into a tech that had sports data, but it was sports data on high school students. So we're talking about minors, and very specifically, it has to do with collegiate athletics in high school and collegiate recruiting and that sort of thing. So it is a big industry, but you're talking about data on minors, you're talking about pictures and photographs on minors. So you've got a whole hotbed of very sensitive information that would be very bad if it were, breached on any level. And so I have absolutely suggested HITRUST as a consideration prior to any actual money exchanging hands. And E1 is a great starting point because, yes, it's a startup. Yes, they can't boil the ocean in a day, but they can put key things in place that will give the investors some level of confidence that they are putting appropriate parameters around very sensitive data.
Yeah,
Anyways.
absolutely. Are you getting approached by anybody that it just doesn't make sense to have an assessment for? I only ask because I have a hospital hardware manufacturer that's talking to me.
Hmm.
And that is all they do. But the hospital's telling them if you are a supplier, you must be high trust certified. And I don't like to talk people out of being business, but they don't have any data anywhere, so I'm struggling to fathom why the hospital's requiring it. But of course, I can't go talk to the hospital. That'd be weirdly inappropriate. And I don't know. I've seen a couple of these now where like even some of the bigger hospital systems have gotten super aggressive and they start saying all of our suppliers that do anything with software must have a high trust certification. And I'm trying to scope an environment with no data.
Is it possible
I
to
mean,
only have the supply chain controls applicable and nothing else?
I I think that may be what it comes down to, but high trust gets fussy about NAs. You try and turn in something with two-thirds NAs, and they get grumpy about that because QA has to review every NA.
there was another
So
guy on here though who had a he runs something like that. It was a few weeks ago, but I think because he was like, yeah, it was actually fairly easy. A lot of it doesn't apply to us, and I was like, that's interesting. But he has a business that by and large they don't absorb any data. They don't, deal with the data. It doesn't come back and forth or anything like that. It was a very narrow slice of the world that he exists in. And so he approached it. I think there were a lot of NAs on his, and I was a bit surprised that he pursued it and, successfully has pursued it, but that it was, something that their organization felt it was necessary, and that the clients felt it was necessary. Um, because if your clients in hardware, you said,
yeah, they make imaging. medical imaging.
I mean,
But
that would kind of be like buying a computer, right? Because if I buy
yeah,
a laptop, are all the computers that the hospital purchases HITRUST certified? I'm guessing not,
yeah, I
because
don't.
that's HITRUST doesn't certify hardware, right? You'd have to get
Yeah,
each one certified in the hospital because they don't, it has to be something that you can actually control the whole environment.
yeah.
That's why they don't do desktop software.
So yeah, and I mean, I'm trying to talk them out of high trust assessment, which is not great for my firm, but
Yeah,
I don't want to sell people something they don't need. But they see,
yeah.
it's coming from one of the big three-letter hospital organizations, and they've said you are a provider and you need to be high trust certified. And I was wondering if that was bubbling up for anybody else, because I've seen a couple of those recently that just not sure. I'm not sure the hospital, whoever's doing the vendor management from the hospitals does not understand something.
They don't understand. Yeah. And they don't understand HITRUST. Somebody has said, we're doing HITRUST, all vendors must be HITRUST certified. And I imagine that whoever said that is probably part of the TPRM um, committee, which HITRUST is part of. But you have to use it with an appropriate lens. So I absolutely agree on that. It is about the data, and it's about data in, data out, data at rest, and putting all the appropriate parameters around it. Um, I don't know. They
I
got me on that.
I was just
Yeah.
curious if it was happening more than to me, because it was just weird to have come up.
Hmm.
With my limited knowledge, yeah, I'd just be taking the argument they are not a downstream subcontractor, they're an
Hmm.
upstream supplier. So, yes, the company needs to do their SR controls due diligence on said entity, but to impose high trust, I'm not getting the logic.
No, companies that require high trust do not make me sad. They put money in my pocket and pay for college for my kids, but I I don't want them to require it when it's unnecessary. That's
Yeah,
frustrating for me.
yeah. No, that's like my client who's going to an I-1. They asked me my perspective on it, and I said, I think it's the right decision for your organization. I think it would be a very good decision. And there was a bit of a chuckle that it would mean less work for me, but from if it's not the right decision for my client, it doesn't feel good for me anyway. So my
Yep.
goal is to help my clients do better, and I'm more than happy to impart my knowledge on anybody who wants to do it. In terms of the project management, the preparation, and the structure. But I'm usually brought in because they don't want to do it.
Yep.
that's, and that's okay with me because it does. If you got to dive in the deep end of the pool, it's much better if you're somebody who likes water.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're happy when people have used somebody that knows what they're doing, and we don't. It keeps us out of that murky. We can't remediate. So I end up in this situation where I'm like, I know exactly how to fix it, and I can tell you exactly how to fix it,
Hmm.
but because I'm going to be assessing it, all I can say is you have to fix this. Good luck.
Right.
So I'm always happy when there's a Sherpa out there, because
Yes.
I don't want to threaten my independence in any way.
Right. And that's where I can help guide. And I'm like, right, so here's what your assessor is telling you. And, do that gentle translation. And here are the options you have to kind of take that forward or tweak that. And I'll often tease my clients and just say, because they'll look at the wording on the controls and they're like, "Ah, we don't understand what that says." I'm like, okay. So, and these are tech folks. So they're
Hmm.
looking at that going, am I not getting it? Did I lose my mind overnight? Because I've been doing this for years and I know my domain, but it doesn't make sense to me. I'm right. So just take a breath. The controls are written in many cases by lawyers. So if you understand that going into it, then you understand that you're not looking at technical specifications, which is, I think, what a lot of people get frustrated with because, they have technical backgrounds. They're looking at this going, why don't I understand this technical specification? because it's not a technical specification. It's a
Yeah.
it's a lawyer speak version. And that's harder. I've read some legal documents in my day and looked at them and gone, okay, I need to break this down. Remember those sentence diagrams? I don't know if they still have to do these in school, but the sentence diagrams, and you're like, here's the subject, here's the, object or whatever it was, and the nouns and verbs and prepositions, and you had to diagram the whole thing. And there are moments where I felt like, okay, from the legal perspective, I've got to break this down into what actually are they saying and scrape out the other bits. That it can be really tricky though, because I can read some of those controls, the newer ones, and I'm looking at it and going, or the elements and going, why did they group
Oh,
these?
yeah.
Why did they group these?
You you get a feel if you do enough assessments on where they came from. Like I can read one and go, that's a NIST requirement. I know that's a
hmm
NIST requirement. That's got
hmm
way too many words in it. Or there'll
Yeah.
be something that's kind of vague, and I'm like, oh, okay, that was pulled from sock. I know where that came from. So that part's kind of funny, but yeah, sometimes the evaluative elements. Where's that 12th one come from? That has nothing to do with the first 11.
Yeah, that there's moments where it feels like somebody's like, well, this doesn't feel like it fits in any of the other ones. Let's add it on. It's okay. But it can be a struggle to dig through all 12 evaluative elements, and make sure every single thing is covered. From the client's perspective, it can be quite grueling. I wish they wouldn't shove 12 or more in a couple of cases in one control. Feels like a lot.
It's especially frustrating in the E1 because you tell people there's only 44 controls, but when one of them's got 21 evaluative elements, it's um, there's where that feels like it's about 15 controls.
Hmm. Yeah, because if there's a ton of evaluative elements and the E1 you have to get, is it at least 75% or is it
82?
82? So they do give more granularity on the
No. Oh,
no.
it's still 75. So what 75, 50? Yeah.
hmm
You have to get an 82 in the domain though, which again,
Yeah.
a reason we like people like you is because people can come to us and you can sync a domain with one control in the E1, which is we insist on doing readiness first because I've never
Yeah.
not passed a high trust assessment and I don't want to start now. So
Right.
I've had a couple people wander off after readiness, just tell me they can't fix it, and we've never done the assessment. But um,
Yeah.
yeah, those big ones, you end up rounding, you end up using the rubric to decide that's a 75. And sometimes it'll be fine. Like, okay, there's 17 evaluative elements and they're not doing two of them, but by your own rubric, that's still 100. So 100.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
they just get long. Like you think, okay, 44, that's going to be easy. And then you get to one of these that has 17 evaluative elements. You're like, oh, this is a 45-minute work paper.
Yeah. Those are the moments where the coffee doesn't seem like it's quite strong enough.
No, no.
Oh, but anyways, you know what? Let's turn this around because we've all got the war stories. Any favorite moments from the past few weeks on High Trust?
I got a R2 back with 4 tasks from QA.
4 total?
4 total. I like average. We asked about their average, and they said it's like 14 to 16 for an assessment, and I got it back with 4, and I was stunned.
That's awesome. Congratulations. It's very
That
buttoned
was
up.
that was a happy, yeah. And then the next one wasn't nearly that good, so that was a fluke. But it was exciting to have it come back with only 4 for an R2. That was
Yeah.
reasonably unheard of. I think the clients don't see how much task work there is because we don't. Most of them are just us.
Yeah.
Um, but you know,
That's
that was
exciting.
that was my happy moment because QA, they like to save QA until I have a really busy week and I'm buried with other stuff or maybe on site with another client, and then 3 of them will come back out of QA with tasks. So the fact that it was only 4 was a little bit of a blessing in that week. So
That sounds good. Blake, do you have any great moments from the past few weeks?
No, sorry. Nothing.
Oh, oh, sorry to hear that.
But thank you.
Well, I've had a couple just, clients that have been really driving and achieving at a great pace. Um, you know, and clients that haven't always been able to achieve at pace. And so those are things that, really make me happy. One client in particular, I got involved. They've brought me in before. It was a mess. I was brought in late. There was, it was a CISO had quit. They were already late. They were already having to get extensions from HITRUST. And it was, I don't think there's a nice word to describe it. It was very hot water. And so it was just jumping in really and helping figure it out. And we did. But at this time, I was brought in at the beginning of a process, and it's really nice to show them how not stressful it can be and that it doesn't require 14-hour days, that it genuinely can be managed in a very measured, calm approach. So that's quite fun. It's when my clients bring me in and I get to do all my organization, that makes me happy because my kids don't let me organize things as much. I like doing, get everything all nice and ordered. It's my happy space. So anyway, I don't have any other, key topics or anything. I'm more than happy to continue the conversation, or if you guys are good, we can probably call it done for the week and we can see you next week. It's up to you.
Sounds good.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining. Greatly appreciate your time today.
See you next
Thank
week.
you.
Bye.
Hey, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. If you got value from this episode, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next HITRUST Secrets. We go live every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central and dig into real-world compliance and security topics. And each session gets uploaded right here after the live show. So whether you're catching us live or on your own time, make sure you're subscribed. We'd love to have you along on your HITRUST journey.